Escalada nuclear de Estados Unidos.
U.S. nuclear escalation. The announcement by U.S. President Donald Trump to restart nuclear testing represents an unprecedented escalation in recent history. None of the major powers, in fact, have conducted nuclear tests since the 1990s. Thus begins a new phase in the geopolitical conflict between the United States, Russia, and China. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from Buenos Aires, Argentina. We begin broadcast number 278 of Demolishing Myths Live. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us with a thumbs up against censorship.
Con el pulgar arriba contra la censura. En esta transmisión vamos a establecer
In this broadcast, we're going to focus on Donald Trump's truly concerning announcement that the United States will soon resume nuclear testing. Clearly, following Russian President Vladimir Putin's recent announcement about successful tests with nuclear-powered weapons, something quite different from nuclear weapons and tests with nuclear warheads, right? Putin, in fact, made two very important announcements this past week. On one hand, the successful test of the Burevestnik nuclear-powered missile, which also has the capacity, of course, to carry a nuclear warhead.
Lógicamente de una cabeza nuclear, pero las pruebas efectivamente no fueron.
But the tests, in fact, were not carried out with a nuclear warhead, but simply with the missile's nuclear propulsion. These missiles feature, and this is their advantage, a very small, miniature nuclear reactor built in, which gives the missile virtually unlimited range. Well, after this announcement, Putin presented another one, perhaps even more grandiose, that of a successful test, this time with a nuclear-powered torpedo known as Poseidon, which, logically, has the capacity to carry a nuclear warhead. But once again, the test was not conducted with a nuclear warhead, only with the missile's nuclear propulsion. Well, obviously this caused panic in the White House, and in line with his record of decisions, his flip-flopping, and his total confusion, Trump must have made a mistake in reading or understanding what had happened. Somewhere he must have seen the words, nuclear test in Russia, or the headline, President Putin announces a test of a nuclear missile, a test of a nuclear torpedo, in the sense of nuclear propulsion, and desperate, frightened, confused, misinformed. In true Trump fashion, he immediately responded with the announcement of a nuclear test with nuclear warheads. This is his announcement. Shortly before the meeting with Xi Jinping, just minutes before that highly anticipated and heavily promoted encounter by President Trump himself, and clearly in a rush from South Korea, where he was attending the ASEAN summit and was about to meet with Xi Jinping within minutes, he made this announcement. The United States possesses more nuclear weapons than any other country. This was achieved through a complete modernization and renewal of the existing arsenal during my first term. Due to its tremendous destructive power, it was very difficult for me to do it, but I had no other choice. Russia ranks second and China a distant third, but the situation will even out in 5 years. Because of other countries' testing programs, I have instructed the Department of War to begin testing our nuclear weapons on equal terms. This process will begin immediately. Thank you for your attention. President Trump. Well, here's proof of his confusion. This part about because of other countries' testing programs.
Esto de debido a los programas de pruebas de otros países, sí, pruebas con propulsión nuclear, no con cargas.
Yes, tests with nuclear propulsion, not with nuclear warheads. In Trump's cognitive capacity, there's no difference between one and the other. And precisely, just a few hours after the publication of this decision, on his plane, on Air Force One, the US presidential aircraft, Trump himself, responding to the press, made the same statements. Here's what was said about these nuclear tests, hours later, on the way to Washington, returning from the meeting with Xi. Pay attention. Well, this is an addition from the colleagues at El Ojo, who do these translations. And indeed rightly so, the clarification. This other countries are conducting nuclear tests. No. Here it's testing, trials of weapons with nuclear propulsion.
La prueba de armas con propulsión nuclear.
And this is the response, repeating the same thing as before. But I want to recall President Putin's statement, repeated many times.
Я хочу напомнить заявление президента Путина, которое неоднократно повторялось, что, конечно же,
That, of course, if someone stops at the assembly, well, these are Trump's first statements.
Bueno, estas las primeras declaraciones de Trump. Como otros realizan pruebas nucleares.
As others conduct nuclear tests, we will conduct nuclear tests as well. And on the other hand, this false claim, our nuclear arsenal is the most powerful in the world. Second, the Russian arsenal. Third, the Chinese arsenal. That's also false. And here are some more statements from Donald Trump on the matter.
Declaraciones más de Donald Trump al respecto. Atención.
We have more than anybody.
Attention.
Third, and
Colleagues, be careful with the count. Indeed, these are the non-deployed nuclear warheads, deployed around 1,500 each, according to the New START treaty. But these are the total warheads, and that United States first, Russia second claim is false. China, moreover, at this point would already be around 1,000 nuclear warheads, according to unofficial reports. But well, indeed, the United States appears in second place. Trump, like a little parrot, simply repeats over and over the same information published on his social network Truth, without the slightest basis.
Sin el más mínimo fundamento. Por aquí también, además, en el mismo viaje, esto solamente...
Over here as well, during the same trip, this just as a side note, a response from Trump about the possibility of a third term.
am I not ruling it out? You'll have to tell me.
Bueno, no lo descarto, dígamelo usted.
Well, I don't rule it out, you tell me. Always with some joke, some tease, some provocation. In principle, Trump can't do it because of the US Constitution. But the promoters of his re-election, his second re-election, the promoters of a third term, argue for the possibility of a different interpretation of the Constitution, so that US presidents could serve multiple terms, as before the constitutional reform that established a maximum limit of 2 terms. The last president, with 3 terms, if I remember correctly, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Well, that's the current situation. Announcement from Russia.
La situación, anuncio de Rusia, pánico en la Casa Blanca,
Panic in the White House. Announcement from the United States. But of course, here problems arise related to agreements, the technical capacity of the United States, and many other additional issues. In total, the United States carried out around 1,000 tests involving nuclear bomb launches since 1945, starting with the now famous Trinity, the world's first nuclear bomb, tested in the United States before the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was presented very clearly today in the Washington Post. Here's the information. From 1945 to 1992, 1945 Trinity, 1992 the last US nuclear test, they basically conducted 1,130 nuclear bomb tests.
1,030 pruebas con bombas nucleares. Desde entonces y tras la caída de...
Since then, and after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, both the United States and Europe and Russia effectively abandoned testing. In 1996, a few years later, they formally established the ban on such tests with the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, enacted that same year. Hence this headline from the Washington Post: Trump orders the Pentagon to conduct nuclear weapons tests for the first time since 1992. The president claimed he wanted the tests to be carried out on equal terms with Russia and China. False. The Kremlin condemned the move and did not indicate when tests might take place. So, that's the information more or less summarized. The problem for Trump goes beyond this specific agreement. It lies in his obsession with the Nobel Peace Prize.
Obsesión con el Premio Nobel de la Paz. Una prueba nuclear de estas características.
A nuclear test of this kind could, logically, spell the end of his hopes for the Nobel Peace Prize next year, as once again pointed out by the Washington Post in this column. Here we go again. Now then, Trump's comments on nuclear testing upend decades of US policy. Here's what you need to know. President Trump has suggested that the United States will resume nuclear weapons testing, a move that overturns decades of American policy. And here, in the body of the article, they indeed emphasize that one of these tests could mark the end of Trump's fantasy of winning the Nobel Peace Prize. The last nuclear test in the world was carried out in 2017 by North Korea.
Fue realizada en 2017 por Corea del Norte. Claro, Corea del Norte no participó en la firma.
Of course, North Korea did not take part in signing the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1996. In fact, in 1996, North Korea still lacked a nuclear bomb. In 2017, it carried out its last test, and since then, almost 10 years, or 8 more precisely, there have been no nuclear tests anywhere in the world, especially not by major powers. Once again, the last one in the United States was in 1992. The announcement generated a great deal of reaction of all kinds, both for and against, in the United States as well as in Russia. In Russia, Peskov indeed responded by rejecting all these claims. "We have not conducted nuclear tests," Peskov said, "nor will we stand idly by and validate the resumption of such actions." He then recalled Putin's offer of a moratorium on the New START treaty, which has effectively been abandoned. Sorry, it was formally abandoned, but not yet in practice. Putin's offer was very clear. If the United States does not abandon it in practice, and does not once again begin to maximize its nuclear capacity in terms of warheads, we will not initiate that escalation either. But of course, if the United States does in fact react in that way, Russia will once again respond in sync. As for the reactions, the first to answer a question on this issue was Mr. J.D. Vance, the vice president, who said the following, also quite out of place, by the way, about Trump's statement, about this announcement. No one can really tell whether this once again stems from Trump's madness and his loose tongue, so to speak, or from a truly calculated plan. Here's J.D. Vance on the matter.
Aquí J.D. Vance al respecto.
Arsenal, obviously, the Russians have a large nuclear arsenal, the Chinese.
Tenemos un gran arsenal, obviamente, los rusos también.
We have a large arsenal, obviously. The Russians also have a large arsenal. The Chinese also have many nuclear weapons, and sometimes you have to test your weapons to make sure they're working properly.
Para saber que están funcionando de manera correcta.
Very closely, even with nations that we don't have the best relations with, to try to limit nuclear proliferation.
Hemos estado trabajando meticulosamente.
We have been working meticulously, even with nations with which we don't have a very good relationship, to reduce the number of nuclear warheads and to curb nuclear proliferation. The president will continue working on that, but at the same time, it's important for US national security. It's important for our national security to ensure that the US nuclear arsenal functions properly. To be clear, we know it works properly, but it's still good to test it in order to keep making improvements. And that's all the president wants. Well, one babble after another, right? This thing of, on one hand, we want the tests, but we want them to determine proper functioning. although we're already sure these weapons work, that they're in good condition, functioning properly. But at the same time, we want improvements to those weapons. On the other hand, the president wants nuclear de-escalation and a reduction of nuclear weapons in the world, even with enemy nations. This being an open reference to Iran. But at the same time, we're going to carry out nuclear tests.
Pero a la vez vamos a realizar pruebas nucleares. Bueno, que sí, que no, que caiga un chaparrón, y esto, por cierto, va...
Well, yes, no, let it pour. And this, by the way, Vance, one of the more thoughtful members, in a way, of Donald Trump's cabinet, obviously can't magically respond to the contradictions in this announcement in favor of nuclear weapons with an unprecedented escalation. And at the same time, there's also Trump's supposed speech against nuclear proliferation. That's why J.D. Vance is facing difficulties. Here's someone a bit more outspoken. Senator Carson, on Fox News, a Republican senator, right at the moment of Donald Trump's arrival in the United States, with a limousine caravan waiting for him to step off the presidential plane. On Fox News, without any hesitation, without a filter, he responded as follows on the same issue. Pay attention.
Well, Sean, I think President Trump once again reflects the sentiment that President Reagan had in the 1980s.
Well, I think President Trump is once again reflecting a sentiment that President Reagan had back in the 80s. Both regretted the need for nuclear weapons and dreamed of a world where we wouldn't need them. But as long as there are adversaries like Communist Russia, back then, by the way, Communist Russia, a fiction in Senator Cotton's head. In any case, the Communist Soviet Union, well, you can't really expect much more from those guys, can you? That's about as far as their effort and intellectual capacity go.
Hasta ahí pueden con su esfuerzo, su capacidad intelectual.
Communist China have nuclear weapons and they're rapidly...
Y siempre y cuando la Rusia comunista...
And as long as Communist Russia and Communist China have nuclear weapons, expand their arsenals, and conduct tests with them, the United States cannot afford to disarm unilaterally. All of this is false, because once again, neither China nor Russia has carried out tests with nuclear warheads. And while in China's case, they are indeed maximizing their nuclear capacity with an increase in warheads consistent with their economic, political, geo-economic, and geopolitical development, Russia shows no changes. It has maintained the same number of nuclear warheads for quite some time. So this claim is false. This generalization about the nuclear development and arsenal expansion of both countries. Anyway, a bit more about Senator Cotton, also with this contradiction. Both Trump and Reagan wanted a world of peace, yet they called for the construction of more nuclear warheads. Strange reasoning. At least Reagan, with some treaties signed together with the Soviet Union at the time, precisely aimed to limit the nuclear arms race. Trump, on the other hand, does exactly the opposite. He keeps unilaterally abandoning one treaty after another, and, in the case of nuclear testing, would now abandon one more unilaterally, the 1996 Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty.
Prohibición completa de los ensayos nucleares. Un poquito más del senador Cotton.
Have to make sure that
A little more about Senator Cotton.
That it won't be overmatched by the combined forces of...
Tenemos que asegurarnos de que nuestro arsenal nuclear...
We must ensure that our nuclear arsenal cannot fall behind anyone's, and that it is superior to the combined arsenals of Russia and China.
Sino aparecer por encima de Rusia y China sumados en conjunto. Una vez más.
Added together, once again.
Won't be overmatched by the combined forces of Russia and China.
Tenemos que asegurarnos de que no vamos a ser nunca el segundo de nadie y que no podemos...
We have to make sure that we will never be anyone's second, and that we cannot be surpassed by the combined strength of Russia and China, which means calling, at the very least, for the creation of 1,000 more nuclear warheads, over 1,000, to bring the total to around 6,500, possibly on the US side, exceeding Russia and China combined.
Por encima, Rusia y China sumadas.
That our aging weapons are still usable and that our new weapons
are designed and made properly. So
tenemos que asegurarnos además de que nuestras viejas armas todavía son.
We also have to make sure that our old weapons are still usable, and that our new weapons are well designed. That's why I agree with what President Trump announced. It makes a lot of sense when Russia and China are threatening the United States with nuclear power.
Cuando Rusia y China están amenazando nuclearmente a los Estados Unidos.
Rapidly growing and novel nuclear arsenal that we have to take steps to defend our way of life, because that's what our...
Y tenemos que tomar para eso medidas para
And we have to take measures to defend our way of life, our way of living, the famous American way of life, the American dream. If they persist in this line of defending the American dream as they have so far, they're going to bring about the destruction of the American dream immediately. And not just because of the economic crisis or the possibility of a civil war within the United States, but directly because of a nuclear strike from the Russians or the Chinese, if they keep pushing this policy of escalation. But anyway, this is how they present this madness to the American electorate. We want more nuclear weapons to defend the American way of life.
Nuclear arsenal does. It truly defends our way of life.
Y eso es lo que hace, lo que hacen las armas.
And that's what nuclear weapons do. They defend our way of life. Well, the narrative of the madness of the Cold War years is becoming more and more present, even from the early 1980s, the first years of Reagan, when any imperial intervention by the United States in the world, for example, in Nicaragua, or any other act of madness, or US involvement in Iran, or anywhere else in the world, was supposedly in defense of the American way of life. Apparently, in the case of the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua, that could lead to the closure of McDonald's fast food chains in the United States.
El cierre de las cadenas de comida rápida de McDonald's, entonces, de alguna manera parecerían relacionados.
So, in some way, the American way of life would seem to be connected to the Sandinista revolution, or the Islamic revolution in Iran, and the US military interventions, whether in Vietnam or elsewhere. This total and absolute delusion. Not all Americans appear as unhinged as these gentlemen. There are also some critical voices around, like this one, from this woman named Beth Sanner, the former Director of National Intelligence of the United States. The position is currently held by, I can't recall the name right now, the Democratic Congresswoman with the white streak of hair. You'll have to help me with this blank in my head. Anyway, this woman responds as follows to the CNN reporter's question.
I personally believe that...
Over here. Personally, I think it's a bad idea to move forward with US nuclear testing. And this is what happens.
And here's why.
Tulsi Gabbard, indeed. Thank you very much. Here, one of Tulsi Gabbard's predecessors responds as follows. I believe that, in my opinion, it's a terrible idea to carry out nuclear tests. Of course, there are restrictions for us. There are people who can argue about this. There are restrictions against conducting tests. But when? Sure, not doing tests has or creates limitations. On one hand,
give carte blanche to everyone else.
But despite these limitations, the alternative would be to test, to conduct nuclear tests. And when you start conducting nuclear tests, you give every country in the world a free pass to do the same.
Because we've tested more than pretty much everyone else. We did thousands.
And the reason we don't run tests is because we've already done more than almost everyone else. We carried out thousands, at least more than 1,000 tests during the Cold War. And the fact that we no longer conduct nuclear tests is because we carried out countless tests in the past, far more than our rivals, at least over 1,000, 1,030, according to the data gathered today by this server, from 1949 to 1992, the last time. Far more than all the countries in the world, by the way. And besides, nowadays, we have computer simulations and experts who tell us we don't really need to do this.
Do you know how many tests China has done?
Do you know how many tests China has done? 50.
¿Sabes cuántas pruebas, cuántos
Do you know how many tests, how many trials China has done? 50. 50 from China versus 1,030 from the United States. And by the way, the point about computer simulation absolutely reflects reality. For a long time now, computer simulations have been able to generate very, very, very accurate predictions, especially in cases like a nuclear simulation. Therefore, in practice, technically, it largely makes no sense to carry out a nuclear test, with all the connotations that implies, when with a computer, they can simulate that test and obtain positive results that are tremendously similar in terms of predictions.
En cuanto a las predicciones, esto aparece probado en cuanto a otras cuestiones, como por ejemplo.
This is proven in other areas, such as climate models. If they can use computers to make predictions about climate issues, rainfall patterns, river systems, well, a whole range of similar things, much less dangerous, and they produce practically perfect predictions. Well, they can do the same with nuclear weapons without conducting nuclear tests, something truly much more dangerous and politically much more costly. A few more reasons from this lady.
Algunas razones más de esta señora.
We've done thousands, 50, or at least over 1,050. So
We've done thousands, or at least more than 50. So when you say we're going to...
Hicimos más de 1,000 y ellos los chinos apenas hicieron 50.
We made over 1,000, and they barely made. The Chinese barely made 50. So now when Trump says we're going to allow the tests, the trials, you're allowing China to run tests.
They're a distant third. What would allow them to catch up faster?
So when the president correctly says that they are a distant third party, what would allow them to get closer faster? Particularly the tests, because they have to.
And that's why, when President Trump says that the Chinese have the third largest arsenal, well, what could slow China down in the growth of its nuclear arsenal? Precisely the fact that they can't conduct nuclear tests.
And this is going to have exactly the opposite effect.
But when we break that, other countries...
That's why my assessment is that although by imposing on ourselves the self-restraint of not conducting tests, we are conceding something in part, at the same time this is much more beneficial because we're not allowing others to do them either.
Our adversaries benefit more.
Our adversaries benefit more than we do.
And
those others are going to benefit much more than we will from these tests. As that lady just said, very good point. Of course, the United States already has thousands or at least more than 1,000 tests conducted. China only 50. And if China can now also start testing, the tests, well, from 50, they'll speed up to much more than 50 in a very short time. And from the third nuclear arsenal, they'll very likely move up to the second or even the first in no time. Once again, a blunder by Trump. Huge, huge as a house, in this mix of bravado and at the same time fear, because this largely stems from the fear sparked by the successful tests of the Burevestnik missile and the Poseidon torpedo.
Y del torpedo Poseidon. Quizás debamos recordar también que
Perhaps we should also remember that Trump's words, both on his social network and in these statements on Air Force One, about anything, often vanish into thin air. Yes, this kind of one day I want nuclear tests, the next day I don't. One day I want Vladimir Putin, another day I don't. One day I want Xi Jinping, another day I don't. One day I want tariffs on everyone, another day I don't. Maybe that's the only hope regarding this issue. But we're certainly facing a dangerous statement here, because this, once again, implies, just by the statement itself, regardless of whether these tests actually happen or not, an unprecedented escalation. Once again, the last nuclear test carried out in the world was in 2017, 8 years ago, by North Korea. But among the major powers, the last one was by the United States in 1992, and since then, never again. By the way, Mr. Mikhail Ulyanov, Russia's permanent representative to the United Nations in Vienna, made a statement. He appeared here just a moment ago. Unfortunately, he's disappeared for now, so I won't be able to show it on screen. But I can. Ah, no. Here it is. This one, apparently yes. Yes, very good, now we'll show it. I want to display it for all of us to see, always keeping our sources visible. Here is his statement. Attention. President Donald Trump's decision to order the Pentagon to immediately resume U.S. nuclear weapons testing requires further clarification.
Armas nucleares estadounidenses requiere mayor aclaración. El presidente de Estados Unidos quiere probar el arsenal nuclear estadounidense.
The President of the United States wants to test the U.S. nuclear arsenal on equal terms with other nuclear powers. However, it should be noted that other nuclear-armed states have not carried out test explosions prohibited by the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, as previously Russia. It recently tested delivery vehicles, not nuclear explosive devices. Such tests have no connection whatsoever with the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Therefore, it is necessary to clearly understand what the United States plans to do and how these plans relate to the provisions of the treaty.
Tratado de prohibición completa de los ensayos nucleares. Bueno, básicamente lo mismo que...
Well, basically the same thing we pointed out at the beginning. The confusion between a nuclear reactor and a nuclear warhead. Obviously, Trump is lost on that. Speaking of Trump being lost, since we didn't go into detail about Trump's tour of Asia, with stops in Malaysia, Japan, and finally the much-publicized meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping, there was no joint press conference afterward, no joint statement, and only one concrete measure taken before the meeting. China reactivated the purchase of US soybeans, about 180 million tons, a few crumbs guaranteed to American farmers and agricultural producers, and a favor to Trump in front of his electoral base, but nothing more than that.
Electoral, pero no más que eso. Queríamos presentar sobre...
We wanted to present, at the end of this broadcast, an analysis of Trump's main policies regarding US foreign policy. Or rather, we wanted to show the outcome of the United States foreign policy since Donald Trump took office 10 months ago, and to make a sort of assessment of its results and geopolitical performance. Trump began, of course, generating a great deal of expectation, especially regarding the possibility of a renewed rapprochement with Russia. He was supposedly going to end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours, and that seemed, apparently, to be the case at the beginning. This appeared in the context of a US policy aimed at re-establishing closer ties with Russia, in order to drive a wedge between Russia and China. Something similar to Kissinger's triangular policy, Kissinger's triangular diplomacy during the Cold War, fostering a good relationship between the United States and Mao Zedong's Communist China, so that this would create tensions between Mao Zedong's Communist China and the Soviet Union, and thus the two enemies of the United States would not appear united against it, but rather in conflict with each other.
Estados Unidos, sino que apareciesen enfrentados entre sí. Bueno, aparentemente Trump quería precisamente algo así.
Well, apparently, Trump wanted precisely something like that, but in reverse, through an approach to his friend Vladimir, as he called and still calls Putin, to create some distance from China. Well, Trump was never able to make the necessary concessions. Putin would not have approved it in any way. But Trump couldn't even present a more or less serious proposal of concessions from the United States and NATO to Russia, to at least create the incentive, the bait, the carrot available to Russia, so that Russia would take this new path, a rapprochement with the United States. Trump couldn't even do that. Not even the bait, the carrot, the hook. He couldn't even present that to the Russians for this purpose. A total failure in that regard. And what does Trump want now in these last few weeks, incredibly, with even less success? Basically the opposite. After being rejected by the Russians, he wanted, at least this past week, to get closer to his new friend Xi Jinping, whom he constantly, in all his speeches, presented as the respected Chinese leader of the respected Chinese nation, after all the insults and provocations carried out by his administration against China. So, what is Trump's proposal in China?
¿Cuál es la propuesta de Trump en el encuentro entre Trump y Xi Jinping el día de ayer?
The meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping yesterday in South Korea was basically the opposite. A sort of attempt by Xi Jinping to charm China into abandoning the purchase of Russian oil. How much and in what currency we make our energy purchases. So we are not going to give up Russian oil, no matter how many suggestions, seductions, or even failed impositions Trump might have tried to establish in that meeting. By the way, speaking of this and of these three nations, here's the difference in the body language of these leaders. Pay attention. On the right, Xi Jinping and Putin in one of their many meetings, and on the left, Putin and Trump. Xi Jinping's face says more than anything else.
Hablando más que cualquier otra cosa. Con Putin sonriente, con su esposa.
With Putin, he's smiling. With his wife, relaxed. With Trump, much more serious, despite Trump's attempts to project a friendly image. That's the difference. Both countries, obviously, both leaders, are aware that if there were a rapprochement with the United States, the US would immediately begin an attack against the third party in this dispute. In the case of a rapprochement with Russia, the United States would immediately begin an attack against China. And in the case of a rapprochement with China, immediately an attack against Russia. From that perspective, then, rapprochement with Russia against China, and now China against Russia, a total and absolute failure of Mr. Donald Trump's policy, President of the United States.
Señor Donald Trump, presidente de los Estados Unidos. Segundo elemento sustancial.
The second substantial element of US foreign policy, of the geopolitics outlined by Trump, is basically his policy toward India, a key player in global geopolitics, not only because of its population, not only because of its growing economic and military capacity, but above all because, until quite recently, India seemed to be a kind of US ally in Asia, and especially against China, due to the historical differences, even border disputes, between India and China. That's why Trump wanted, in a way, to win Indian support. But instead of pursuing a policy of persuasion, of establishing a policy of rapprochement with India, of soft power, or soft politics, as it's called, through personal, economic, cultural, diplomatic, financial, and institutional relations, all the subtle ways of building closeness, well, instead of that, he began a policy of harassment, of bullying, just as he did with Europe. And the Indians, with much more dignity and a stronger sense of national sovereignty than the Europeans, instead of responding by bowing their heads, instead of accommodating Donald Trump's wishes, basically responded by rejecting the impositions and turning toward the BRICS. That's why, due to the pressure and provocations from the United States against India, above all, the increase in trade tariffs, and even more, the imposition of tariffs as a result of India's purchase of Russian oil, this shift in orientation took place.
Como producto de la compra de petróleo ruso, ¿sí? De la noche a la mañana determinaron los estadounidenses que
overnight, Americans decided that Russian oil was to disappear from the international market, as something somehow negative, sinful, forbidden. They set that rule on their own, just because they could, because supposedly they can decide whatever they want. And anyone who bought Russian oil would end up on the sanctions list. And who did they impose sanctions on? Only on India, not on China. They couldn't possibly do that, nor on any other country, including European ones, some of which have governments very close to Trump's, such as Orban's, for example.
muy cercanos al gobierno de Trump, como por ejemplo el gobierno de Orbán. Contra ninguno de esos estableció sanciones, tampoco estableció.
He didn't impose sanctions on any of them, nor did he impose sanctions on other European countries that were buying Russian energy. He only did so against India. And the Indians, faced with this offense, this provocation, responded by raising the stakes. Well, you don't want trade with us? We'll impose reciprocal tariffs, and we're not going to stop buying Russian energy. Moreover, we're going to move closer to the BRICS, and above all, to China. This rapprochement, by the way, was not only negative for the United States, in the sense of abandoning a regional ally like India, and fostering an alliance between two emerging powers like India and China, but it also led to closer ties between India and Afghanistan.
Un acercamiento entre India y Afganistán. Sí, recuerden que en este sentido,
remember that, in this regard, until not so long ago, the United States was involved in internal conflicts by occasionally supporting Pakistan and India. When the confrontation between India and Pakistan began, supposedly Trump pacified the situation. Both the Indians and the Pakistanis reject this. But specifically, the rapprochement between India and China also led to a rapprochement between China and Afghanistan, and this later resulted in a confrontation between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Remember that India is effectively located between China and... Pakistan, my apologies. Pakistan is located between China and Afghanistan.
Pakistan aparece entre China y Afganistán, ¿sí?
When Trump generated rejection among the Indians, hostility among the Indians, that also caused the Afghans, who were becoming increasingly close to the Indians and the Chinese, to now appear against Pakistan. And therefore, one of the United States' allies in the region, Pakistan, now finds itself surrounded not only by India and China on one side, but also by Afghanistan on the other. So, Trump's policy regarding a key player like India, ever more involved in the BRICS, was disastrous. A second geopolitical failure of enormous troubling proportions for President Trump. Third element of his foreign policy, of his geopolitical guidelines, basically the policy regarding Israel. So far, Trump's policy toward Israel has validated Israel's attacks on everyone, on all its neighbors. It has created a situation in which Israel, in the region, appears completely out of control, perpetrating atrocities, massacres, a genocide against the Palestinians, and also carrying out bombings and attacks against Lebanon. Even today, despite the ceasefire truce, in which, incidentally, the United States was supposedly to participate as a guarantor, Israel keeps pounding and pounding, violating the ceasefire against Lebanon.
Permanentemente machaca y machaca violando el alto el fuego contra el Líbano, lo mismo contra los gazatíes, antes de la caída de al-Assad.
The same against the Gazans. Before the fall of al-Assad, it also carried out attacks against Syria without rhyme or reason. The same against Yemen, attacks even, in some cases, well, against Iraq, naturally, and also against the triple border between Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. Its policy regarding Israel also validated an attack against Iran, which triggered the 12-day war and the need for a last-minute intervention by the United States due to the Israelis' desperation in the face of Iran's missile response. And finally, his policy toward Israel, Trump's policy, led even this unrestrained Israel, acting without any control, to carry out an attack against Qatar, one of the United States' major allies in the region. It was an airstrike targeting Hamas leaders during a meeting on Qatari territory, in the context of efforts to reach a ceasefire. Well, Israel wanted to decapitate Hamas's leadership and launched an attack on Qatari soil, which, on top of everything, was unsuccessful and failed to achieve its intended results. They were unable to kill those Palestinian leaders. But beyond that, we witnessed an unprecedented situation, with Israeli attacks against Qatar, one of the most important US allies in the region, and one of the main financiers of US policy toward the Middle East. In the face of the crisis in the United States and deindustrialization, Trump is seeking a lot of money from the Middle East, from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and others, to help reactivate the US economy.
Para la reactivación de la economía estadounidense. Y en ese marco, Netanyahu machaca contra Qatar.
And in that context, Netanyahu lashes out at Qatar. So Israel is out of control, the Middle East is a powder keg, another total and absolute failure of Trump in the region. Tariff agreements, another one of his geopolitical lines, all over the place, here and there. Some agreements have been signed, but still nothing with the main trading partners, not only of the United States, but of the world. With China, stalled. With India, stalled. With Brazil, stalled. With South Africa, also stalled. Some agreements were signed with those who capitulate, at least in face-to-face negotiations, like the Europeans, the Japanese, or the Koreans. On one hand, these agreements were certainly achieved, but on the other, no one is putting them into practice. No one is fulfilling them. Among other things, Europe, for example, was supposed to remember this, channel an annual investment of 600 billion euros, and it is not making a 600 billion euro investment in the United States, far from it, nor massive energy purchases as supposedly committed to in those agreements. So very grandiose agreements, but none of them fulfilled, and the most important ones still in trouble. The same goes for Japan. Japan also made some investment promises, but those promises were never kept, and it didn't stop buying Russian energy either. So yet another foreign policy failure for Trump on that issue. With Iran, everything went wrong. Yes, they supported Israel in the attack. Afterward, they had to appear as Israel's saviors. But with a limited strike and an understanding with Iran to avoid the total destruction of Iran's missile arsenals, while also ensuring that the Iranians wouldn't destroy the US base in Qatar. Almost a simulated attack by the Iranians in agreement with the United States. Well, the thing with India and Pakistan, another farce too. Ultimately, in geopolitical terms, it's one mistake after another, disaster after disaster, beyond the bombastic announcements. And now, to wrap up this analysis, one more problem with this statement about nuclear tests, possibly one of Trump's many slip-ups, one of his many statements just for being loudmouthed, fickle, hot-headed, a bully, a thug. But even so, this is already triggering a very, very dangerous escalation. Folks, please support us with a thumbs up.
Por favor, acompáñennos con el pulgar arriba. Hoy no nos pudo acompañar Juan Antonio Aguilar debido a...
Juan Antonio Aguilar couldn't join us today because he's traveling abroad, which is why he's not here with us, but he'll be back, as always, next week on Friday. In just a little while, Fernando Moragon's show on DMP geopolitics will begin, focused on the now almost official fall of Pokrovsk. We won't be introducing it here because Fernando will surely explain it in detail in just a few minutes, 40 minutes to be exact. So don't miss that broadcast. And we'll be back here again tomorrow, as every Saturday. To Beatriz Pulido, our moderator, thank you as always for being with us, and to all the demolishers, a kiss, a hug, and see you tomorrow.